It was an ordinary morning in the small but cozy diner, a place where locals came to grab their breakfast or enjoy a warm cup of coffee before they went about their day. The diner had a welcoming atmosphere, with the smell of sizzling bacon, fresh coffee brewing, and the gentle hum of quiet conversations between regular customers. It was a familiar scene, one that had played out hundreds of times over the years as the diner was known for its homey feel and quick service. Sarah, the waitress working the morning shift, was in the middle of her routine. She had been working at the diner for several years, and it felt like second nature to her now. Every morning she greeted the regulars with a smile, took their orders, and kept the coffee cups full. The customers knew her and she knew them. The rhythm of her job was steady and predictable, and she liked it that way. There was something comforting about working in a place where everyone knew each other, where nothing much ever seemed to change. Sarah was proud of her role in the diner, feeling a sense of responsibility toward the people who came in each day. As the clock ticked, a man walked into the diner. He was dressed casually, but there was something about his posture and the way he moved that caught Sarah's attention. It was nothing extraordinary, just the kind of presence that made someone stand out from the crowd. He wasn't loud or flashy. He simply had an air of confidence that made people take notice. He was a black man in his early 40s, his face calm and unbothered, but his eyes held an intelligence and understanding that seemed to come from experience. James had been coming to the diner for months now, but he wasn't someone who drew attention to himself. He didn't seek out conversation, nor did he linger longer than necessary. He was just another customer, quietly enjoying his meals and sitting in his usual spot at the counter. He liked it that way, low-key and undisturbed. On this particular day, as James entered the diner and took his usual seat, he noticed Sarah behind the counter as always. He gave her a polite nod, the kind you give to someone you've seen many times but never really spoken to. Sarah responded with a brief, friendly smile, not thinking much of him as she continued with her work. After a moment, James looked around the diner for a bit before turning his attention back to Sarah. He had been feeling a bit uncomfortable, like he needed to use the restroom, but it wasn't urgent. Still, he decided it would be best to ask. He waited for her to finish serving another customer before politely raising his hand to catch her attention. "Excuse me, can I use the restroom?" James asked calmly, his voice smooth and unhurried. There was nothing unusual about his request. It was a simple ask that anyone would make when they needed to use the facilities. Sarah paused for a second, looking at him with a slight frown before answering. "Sorry, we have a policy. Only customers who've ordered food are allowed to use the restroom." James raised an eyebrow, not fully understanding the reasoning behind her response. "I've been coming here for months. I always order food when I come in," he said, trying to keep his tone polite and patient. It seemed like a reasonable request. He was a paying customer after all, and had never had an issue with using the restroom before. But Sarah, without a second thought, shook her head. "I know, but that's the rule," she replied dismissively, not offering any further explanation. She then quickly turned her attention back to the other customers as if the matter was settled. There was no warmth in her words, just a cold finality that left James feeling a bit taken aback. James sat there for a moment, unsure of how to respond. He glanced around the diner where a few regulars were having their meals, but no one seemed to be paying much attention. He thought for a second about just letting it go, but something about the way Sarah had spoken to him rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't just about the restroom. It was the tone, the way she seemed to treat him as if his request didn't matter, as if he wasn't important enough to be granted the same consideration as other customers. He decided to speak up again. "Are you sure? I've seen people come in here, order just a coffee, and still use the restroom," he said, keeping his voice steady. There was a hint of frustration now, though he was still trying to keep his calm. It wasn't about the restroom itself, but the feeling that something more was at play here. Why was he being singled out? Sarah looked at him for a moment, her expression unchanged. "Look, that's just the rule," she repeated, her tone more abrupt this time. "If you're not ordering food, you can't use the restroom." She seemed to have no interest in engaging further, as if her decision was final. James sat back in his seat staring at her, his mind racing. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. It wasn't just about the restroom anymore. It was about something deeper. He had been coming to this diner regularly, paying for his meals like everyone else. But now he was being told he wasn't allowed to use the same restroom that any other customer could access. As Sarah moved away to attend to another table, James felt a surge of emotion, a mix of frustration and confusion. He had experienced this kind of treatment before, but not in a place like this. The diner had always felt like a safe space, a place where he could simply relax and enjoy a meal without worrying about the judgments of others. But now it seemed like that comfort had been shattered. A part of him wanted to leave, to walk out and never come back. But another part of him, the part that had been quiet for so long, knew he couldn't just let this slide. He wasn't going to let her dismiss him like this, to treat him as if he didn't belong. This wasn't just about a restroom, it was about respect. James leaned back in his seat, taking a deep breath. He knew he had to handle this carefully. He wasn't the type to start a scene, but he also wasn't going to let Sarah's words go unchallenged. He decided to wait, to let the situation unfold a little further before he made his next move. As he sat there, he couldn't help but think about how quickly Sarah had made her decision. It was almost as if she had already judged him before he even opened his mouth. She didn't know who he was or what he was capable of. To her, he was just another black man in the diner, someone who didn't deserve the same treatment as everyone else. But James wasn't just any customer. He wasn't just someone who came in for a meal and left. He was part of the fabric of the diner, and he knew it. What Sarah didn't know was that James owned the place. The thought gave him pause, and for a moment he felt the weight of the situation. How would she react if she knew? Would it change anything? Or would it make the tension even worse? He didn't want to escalate things unnecessarily, but the truth was that James had been silent for far too long. He had been coming to this diner for months, and he had never once let on that he owned it. It wasn't something he liked to advertise. But now, in this moment, it felt like the right time to reveal the truth. James sat quietly at the counter, his mind racing with thoughts. The more he thought about Sarah's dismissive tone and the way she had refused him, the more frustrated he became. It wasn't just the restroom anymore. It was the treatment he had received, the feeling of being belittled, and how quickly she had written him off. He could tell that something deeper was at play, but he wasn't entirely sure what it was. Maybe it was just a misunderstanding. Maybe Sarah had a bad day. Or maybe there was something else behind her behavior. He glanced around the diner, watching the other customers as they sipped their coffee and ate their meals. No one seemed to be paying attention to the exchange between him and Sarah. Most of the people were absorbed in their own little worlds, catching up with friends, scrolling through their phones, or reading the newspaper. It was a typical morning at the diner, and everything seemed to be business as usual. But for James, the comfortable hum of the place had been disrupted. The situation was becoming bigger than he had anticipated. Sarah, meanwhile, had gone back to serving her customers. She walked around the diner with her usual air of confidence, refilling drinks and taking new orders. To her, the interaction with James was just another small moment in her day. She had worked at the diner for so long that she had become accustomed to the daily routine, the customers she saw every day, and the policies that had always been in place. The rules were simple. Customers who ordered food could use the restroom. It was a rule she had enforced for years without much thought. In her mind, it made sense. After all, why would someone who hadn't ordered anything need to use the restroom? It was just the way things were. But Sarah's mind was elsewhere as she went about her work. She had seen James come in countless times before, but she hadn't given him much thought. He was just another regular customer. She didn't know much about him, where he came from, what he did, or who he really was. To her, he was just another man who ordered his coffee and ate his meal without making much of a fuss. But there was something about James that day, something about the way he had spoken to her, the way he had questioned her decision, that unsettled her. She wasn't used to being challenged like that. Usually her customers followed the rules without question, but James wasn't like the others. He had a quiet authority about him, and it made her feel uncomfortable. As Sarah moved through the diner, she couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She had seen other customers use the restroom without ordering food, but she had never really questioned it. Maybe it wasn't such a strict rule after all. But still, she wasn't about to back down. She had always followed the rules, and she wasn't about to make exceptions for one person. The thought of bending the policy for James didn't sit right with her. It wasn't personal. It was just the way things were done at the diner. James, however, couldn't stop thinking about the situation. He had been treated like this before in other places, but it always stung. He was used to the subtle ways people sometimes made him feel like he didn't belong. But this was different. There was something in Sarah's attitude that seemed to go beyond a simple misunderstanding. It was like she had assumed something about him the moment he walked through the door. He had never experienced such an immediate sense of judgment. For a moment, James considered just letting it go. He could get up, pay for his coffee, and leave. He didn't need the restroom that badly. But there was a nagging feeling in the back of his mind that told him this wasn't something he could just ignore. He knew that if he didn't speak up, the same thing could happen to someone else, someone who might not have the confidence to stand their ground. He couldn't let this slide. Not this time. As he sat there, his mind drifted back to the first time he had walked into the diner. He remembered how welcoming it had felt, the friendly faces, the comforting atmosphere, the way the staff made him feel like a valued customer. Back then, he had just been another person looking for a good meal. But over time, he had come to appreciate the quiet charm of the place. It was more than just a diner to him. It had become a part of his daily routine, a place where he could relax and enjoy a moment of peace in an otherwise busy world. James had been coming to the diner for months now, but he had never mentioned to anyone that he was the owner. It wasn't something he liked to bring up. He wasn't the type to flaunt his success or seek attention. But now, as he sat there, he realized that his silence had allowed for situations like this to occur. He had never made it clear that he was in charge, that he had a say in how things ran. Maybe if Sarah knew who he was, she would think twice before treating him the way she had. It wasn't about being better than anyone else or using his position to get special treatment. It was about the respect that every customer, no matter who they were, deserved. He knew that if he revealed who he was now, it would change everything. Maybe, not just for Sarah, but for the entire diner. It was possible that his actions in this moment could reshape the way things were done here, but he wasn't sure if he was ready to make that choice. As the minutes ticked by, James weighed his options. He could keep quiet and let Sarah's behavior slide, or he could confront the situation head-on and reveal the truth. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the right thing to do was to speak up. He had built this diner from the ground up, working tirelessly to create a space where everyone felt welcome. And yet, here he was, being treated as though he didn't belong. That wasn't the kind of environment he wanted to create. After a few moments, James stood up from his seat and walked toward the back of the diner, where the manager's office was located. The manager, a middle-aged man named Frank, was someone James had worked with for years. Frank had always been reliable, and James knew he could count on him to help resolve any issues that came up. James knocked on the door before walking in. Frank looked up from his desk, surprised to see him. "Hey, James, what's up?" Frank asked, his voice casual. "I need to talk to you about something," James said, his tone steady but serious. Frank raised an eyebrow. "Sure. What's going on?" James explained the situation, how Sarah had refused to let him use the restroom, despite the fact that he was a paying customer. He explained how it made him feel humiliated and disrespected, and how he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about the way Sarah had treated him. Frank listened intently, his face growing more serious as James spoke. He could tell that James wasn't the type to make a big deal out of small things, so if he was bringing this up, it had to be important. Once James finished explaining, Frank sat back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "I'll have a word with Sarah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "This isn't the way we do things here. I'll make sure it's taken care of." James nodded, but there was still a feeling of unease in his chest. He didn't want to cause trouble, but he couldn't let what had happened go unaddressed. He knew that sometimes people needed a wake-up call to realize how their actions could hurt others, and he was determined to make sure Sarah understood just how important it was to treat every customer with respect, no matter who they were or where they came from. James stood in Frank's office for a few moments, feeling a strange mix of emotions. It wasn't easy for him to confront the situation like this. He wasn't someone who liked to stir trouble or create awkwardness. But this time, something about the way Sarah had acted pushed him to speak up. He had built the diner from the ground up, and he cared deeply about the way it operated, not just in terms of the food and service, but also the atmosphere. He wanted everyone who came in, regardless of who they were, to feel respected and valued. Frank seemed like he understood where James was coming from. He had known the manager for years, and James trusted him to take care of the matter. Frank was a good guy, and James knew that he wouldn't brush off the issue. Still, there was something nagging at him. What if Frank didn't take it seriously? What if this was brushed under the rug and the problem didn't get addressed properly? James didn't want to have to keep dealing with situations like this in the future. "Thanks, Frank," James said, his voice steady. "I appreciate it. I just want to make sure this doesn't happen again. We can't have people feeling like they're not welcome here." Frank nodded, his expression thoughtful. "Don't worry, James, I'll talk to her. It's important that we all make sure customers feel at home here, no matter what." As James left Frank's office, he felt a small sense of relief. It wasn't over yet, but he had taken the first step to make things right. He didn't know what would happen next or how Sarah would respond, but at least the issue was in the right hands. He was eager to see how things would unfold, though a part of him still couldn't shake the frustration he had felt earlier. It wasn't just about the restroom. It was about the fact that Sarah had decided to treat him differently without any reason, without even taking a moment to understand who he was. James walked back into the main part of the diner, taking a deep breath as he approached the counter. He was careful to keep his demeanor calm, but inside his thoughts were racing. He wasn't sure if Sarah knew that he was the owner of the diner. He hadn't made that clear before, and he preferred to keep things low-key. But now, more than ever, he wondered if she had been treating him differently because of who he was. It wasn't something he liked to think about, but there was no denying the way the situation had unfolded. As James sat back down at the counter, he tried to focus on the present moment. He wasn't here to cause a scene. He just wanted to enjoy his coffee and let things settle down. He had learned to pick his battles over the years, but this one felt important. It wasn't just about him. He had to think about the people who came into the diner every day, some of whom might not have the confidence to stand up for themselves like he had. He wanted to make sure that the environment at the diner remained a place where everyone felt welcome, no matter their background. Sarah continued to move about the diner, oblivious to the fact that James was sitting there, quietly observing her. He could tell she was busy, trying to juggle multiple tasks at once. There was no sign of any recognition in her eyes, no acknowledgement that anything unusual had happened. She served a couple of regulars, refilled their coffee cups, and wiped down the counter. To anyone else, it seemed like a normal day at the diner. James watched her for a moment, his mind still spinning. What was going through her head? Did she realize how much of a misstep she had made? Or was she so caught up in the daily routine that it didn't even cross her mind? James didn't know the answer, but he had a feeling that the conversation with Frank would be a turning point. Soon enough, Sarah came over to the counter, her hands busy with a notepad and a pen. She gave James a quick smile, but this time, it seemed more forced than before. "What can I get for you today?" she asked, her tone polite but not warm. James took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'll just have the usual, thanks," he replied, his voice steady. He didn't want to make things worse or escalate the situation further. He wasn't there to make Sarah feel bad. He just wanted things to go back to normal. She nodded and walked away. But James couldn't help but notice how she seemed to avoid making eye contact. She was clearly aware that something had changed, though she didn't know exactly what. As Sarah walked back to the kitchen to place his order, James couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. It wasn't just a small mistake. It had been a moment that highlighted the subtle ways that people made assumptions based on race, class, or even just appearance. The truth was, no one had bothered to ask him who he was or what he was doing in the diner. To Sarah, he was just another black man who had walked in off the street, someone who didn't quite fit the usual mold of the customers she served. James had seen this happen before, in other places and in other situations. He had often been made to feel as though he didn't belong, like he was an outsider in spaces that were supposed to be inclusive. It wasn't just a one-time thing. It was a recurring pattern in his life, but that didn't make it any easier to deal with. It was exhausting, always having to prove yourself, always having to fight against preconceived notions. But as James sat there, sipping his coffee and waiting for his meal, something inside him shifted. He realized that he didn't have to keep quiet anymore. He didn't have to silently accept the way people treated him. He had the power to make a difference, to stand up for himself and for others who might face the same treatment. The diner wasn't just his business. It was his way of creating a space where everyone could feel equal, no matter where they came from or what they looked like. As Sarah returned to the counter with James's breakfast, she placed the plate in front of him, her movements quick and somewhat stiff. She didn't say much, and James could tell that she was still trying to process the situation. There was an awkwardness between them, a tension that hadn't been there before. He could see it in the way she avoided his gaze and in the way she tried to act like everything was normal. James looked at her for a moment, his eyes softening. He knew this wasn't easy for her. Maybe she was embarrassed, maybe she was angry. He wasn't sure. But he also knew that this was a learning moment, not just for Sarah, but for everyone in the diner. He didn't want to make her feel worse, but he also didn't want to let this moment slip by without addressing it. "Look, Sarah," James said, his voice calm, "I know this is awkward, but I think it's important that we talk about what happened earlier. I don't expect you to apologize or anything, but I just want to make sure we're all on the same page moving forward." Sarah looked at him, her face tense. She didn't speak at first, but after a few seconds she nodded. "Yeah. I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel like that." James gave her a small nod in return, his expression understanding. "I know you didn't. But it's important that we treat everyone with respect no matter who they are. And I'm sure you didn't mean to make me feel less than. But I've been coming here for months, and I'm not just another customer. I'm the owner of this place." Sarah's eyes widened in surprise, her face flushing slightly. She didn't know how to respond at first, and James could see that she was taken aback. But he didn't want to make her feel embarrassed. He just wanted her to understand the impact of her actions. There was a brief moment of silence after James spoke. The words hung in the air between them as Sarah stood there, stunned by the revelation. She blinked a couple of times, processing what James had just said. She had always known there was something about him, something different from the other customers, but never in her wildest dreams had she imagined that the man who regularly sat at the counter, drinking his coffee, was actually the owner of the diner. For a split second, she didn't know how to respond. Her thoughts raced, trying to make sense of everything. Had she really just refused to let the owner of the diner use the restroom? It felt like a dream, a mistake she wished she could take back. She looked at James, who remained calm, his expression neutral but steady. You're the owner?" she finally managed to say, her voice betraying a mix of shock and embarrassment. James nodded, his face still composed. "Yes. I own this diner. I've been coming here for months now, and I've always tried to keep a low profile. I didn't think it was necessary to make a big deal out of it." He paused, looking her in the eyes. "But now I think it's important that you know. Not just because I own the place, but because the way you treated me earlier doesn't align with the values I want this diner to represent." Sarah took a deep breath, her mind racing. She couldn't believe what had just happened. In her years of working in the diner, she had never once considered that she might be disrespecting someone so important to the business. She had never thought that one of her actions, however small it seemed, could lead to this level of consequence. She felt a knot in her stomach, a heavy mix of guilt and regret. She had been so quick to judge him, to dismiss his simple request, without even considering who he was or why he was asking. I'm really sorry," she stammered, her voice quieter now. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know who you were. I thought you were just another customer." She trailed off, her words faltering as she realized how ridiculous her reasoning sounded now. James gave her a small, understanding nod. "I get it. You didn't know. But that's part of the problem, isn't it? You didn't take a moment to consider that I might be someone who deserves the same level of respect as anyone else." He paused, for a moment letting the weight of his words sink in. "And it's not just about me. This is about every single person who walks through that door. The people who sit at this counter, order their food, and trust that they'll be treated fairly and respectfully. It's not just about policies or rules. It's about making sure that everyone, regardless of who they are, feels like they belong here." Sarah's face softened and her eyes began to well up with tears. She hadn't meant to hurt anyone. She had never thought about the deeper implications of her actions before. She had never thought about how easy it was to unintentionally make someone feel small, to make them feel like they didn't belong. And now, standing in front of James, she realized just how much she had taken for granted the simple, basic decency of treating others with kindness and respect. I never thought about it like that," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I've worked here for so long, and I've always just done what I was told, followed the rules. But I can see now that it's more than just following the rules. It's about the way we treat each other." She paused, her throat tight. "I really messed up, didn't I?" James shook his head gently. "It's not about blaming anyone, it's about learning from our mistakes, understanding why they happened, and making sure they don't happen again. We all have things to learn, myself included. The important thing is how we move forward." There was a long pause, and Sarah stood there processing everything James had said. She had always prided herself on being a good person, on being kind and understanding, but this was a wake-up call. She had let a small moment of frustration dictate her actions, and now she saw how that simple mistake had hurt someone. Worse, still, it had hurt the very person who made the diner what it was. "I really am sorry," Sarah repeated, her voice much softer now. "I didn't mean to make you feel less than anyone else, especially not here of all places." James smiled slightly, though it was tinged with the seriousness of the conversation. "I know you didn't mean to, but it's important to realize how these things can affect people, especially when they're already in a vulnerable situation. No one should ever feel like they're not welcome or that they don't matter, no matter who they are or where they come from." At that moment, Sarah realized just how much she had underestimated the weight of her words and actions. She thought of all the customers she had served over the years, each one a person with their own story, their own struggles, and their own experiences. She realized that she had become so wrapped up in the daily grind of work that she had stopped truly seeing the people in front of her. She had seen them as just customers, as people to serve and move on from, rather than individuals who deserved respect and dignity. She glanced at James, who was still sitting there, his gaze steady but not unkind. "What can I do to make this right?" she asked earnestly, her voice full of sincerity. "I don't want this to be the way you remember me." James considered her, questioned for a moment, and then he spoke. "I appreciate your apology, Sarah. And I think the most important thing you can do is learn from this and understand that we all have a responsibility to treat others with respect, no matter who they are. It doesn't matter if they're a regular customer, a first-time visitor, or even the owner of the diner. Everyone deserves to be treated with kindness and fairness. That's what I want this place to be known for." Sarah nodded, her heart heavy, with the weight of the lesson she had just learned. "I will. I'll do better. I promise." James gave her a reassuring smile. "I believe you." As Sarah walked away to continue her work, she felt a strange sense of relief mixed with determination. She had messed up, but she was committed to making things right. She didn't want to repeat the same mistake again, and she didn't want to make anyone else feel the way she had made James feel. Meanwhile, James remained at the counter, sipping his coffee in quiet contemplation. It wasn't easy to address a situation like this, but he knew that it was necessary. He didn't want to create a scene, but sometimes, in order to move forward, difficult conversations had to happen. He could tell that Sarah was genuinely remorseful and willing to change, and that gave him hope that things could improve. The diner had always been a place where people gathered to share meals and stories, and James wanted it to remain that way, a space where everyone felt welcome and valued. It wasn't just about the food or the service, it was about creating an environment where kindness and respect were the foundation of everything that happened there. As he finished his coffee and prepared to leave, James felt a quiet sense of satisfaction. He had done what he needed to do, not just for himself, but for the people who came into his diner every day. It wasn't always easy, but he knew it was the right thing to do. And in the end, that was what mattered the most. The days that followed James's conversation with Sarah were a mix of reflection and change. As the owner of the diner, he knew that this moment had marked something bigger than just a simple misunderstanding. It had become a lesson not only for Sarah but for everyone involved in the diner. He was determined to make sure that this incident wasn't something that just passed by without leaving a lasting impact. Change, after all, required more than just words. It needed action. Sarah was quieter in the days following the exchange. She had always been a hardworking waitress, but now there was a new layer to her work ethic. Every day she came in, she took extra care with her customers, listening to them more attentively and making sure they felt seen. Sarah had always been good at her job, but now she wanted to be better, not just at serving food, but at understanding people. She had realized that it wasn't enough to follow the rules blindly. She had to understand the reason behind them, the feelings that those rules might affect. She even started to read more about the importance of inclusivity in customer service, taking it upon herself to educate herself. Sarah knew that she couldn't undo what had happened, but she could change how she approached her interactions with others. Every morning when she entered the diner, she looked at her job with a new perspective. She wanted to be someone who made people feel welcome, who gave them the respect they deserved from the very moment they walked in the door. It wasn't going to be easy to change old habits, but she was willing to put in the effort. As for James, he also took time to reflect on the situation. He thought about how often he had let things slide, how many small moments he had chosen to overlook because he didn't want to cause a scene. He realized that, just like Sarah, he had to do better too. He had built the diner into a place of community, but he had neglected to make sure that everyone who worked there fully understood the values he wanted to promote. It wasn't just about serving good food, it was about creating an environment that was welcoming and fair to everyone. James spent the next few days talking to the rest of the staff. He didn't want to make a big public announcement, but he did want to have individual conversations with everyone. He explained to them the importance of treating each customer with kindness, respect, and empathy. He shared his own experiences and told them how sometimes the smallest actions could have the biggest impact. It wasn't about giving special treatment, it was about ensuring equality and fairness for everyone, regardless of who they were. There were a few awkward moments in the days that followed. Sarah was still adjusting to the idea that she had made a mistake, and James was trying to find the balance between being understanding and holding her accountable. But over time, their relationship began to improve. Sarah appreciated that James wasn't just demanding a change, but was also willing to guide her through it. She began to see him less as an authority figure and more as someone who genuinely cared about the people who worked with him. Meanwhile, the regular customers started to notice a shift in the atmosphere of the diner. The vibe was subtly different, warmer, more open, and inclusive. People who had been coming in for years but hadn't really talked to anyone began striking up conversations with the staff. Even the older customers, who were often a bit set in their ways, started greeting Sarah with a friendlier smile. It was as though the whole place had shifted in the best way possible, and the energy was contagious. One day, a new customer came into the diner. He was a young man, probably in his mid-20s, and he had a slightly nervous look about him as he walked up to the counter. He had never been to the diner before, and Sarah immediately noticed how uncertain he seemed. Instead of just taking his order and moving on, she struck up a conversation with him. She asked about his day, made a light-hearted joke about the weather, and welcomed him like an old friend. By the time he left, he was smiling and chatting with her like they had known each other for years. James watched the interaction from across the room, and a small smile spread across his face. It wasn't a grand gesture, but it was an important one. Sarah was making the kind of connection with this customer that he had always hoped for in his diner. A simple, genuine moment of kindness. This was what he wanted the diner to stand for. As time passed, Sarah became known for her exceptional customer service. It wasn't just about remembering regulars' names or their orders. It was about the way she made everyone feel like they belonged. She went out of her way to make sure that every customer, no matter their background, felt seen and heard. And it was clear that her efforts were paying off. Customers came in not just for the food, but because of the atmosphere Sarah and the rest of the staff had cultivated. One day, as James sat at the counter enjoying his lunch, Sarah approached him. She had a cup of coffee in her hand, and she placed it in front of him with a smile. "How's everything today?" she asked, genuinely interested. James took a sip of his coffee and nodded. "Perfect, as usual. You've been doing great lately," she smiled, though there was a hint of modesty in her expression. "Thanks. It's been a learning experience, that's for sure." James leaned back in his chair, taking a moment to look around the diner. He saw the same regulars, the same familiar faces, but today something felt different. The environment felt lighter, more welcoming. It was a place where people could relax and be themselves. It wasn't just about the food. It was about the experience of being there, of knowing that you were treated like you mattered. "I'm proud of the work you've been doing, Sarah," James said. "This place is starting to feel the way I've always wanted it to feel." Sarah's eyes brightened. "I'm just doing my best to keep the spirit of the place alive. It's important to me, too." James smiled and nodded. "I can tell, and that's what makes all the difference." After a moment, Sarah turned to take care of another table, and James continued to reflect on everything that had happened. It had been a difficult and uncomfortable situation at first, but in the end, it had sparked a chain of positive changes. The diner had become more than just a place for food. It had become a place for connection, a place where everyone was treated with dignity and respect. As James finished his meal, he couldn't help but feel hopeful. The diner was in good hands, not just because of the food or the service, but because of the people who worked there. They understood the importance of creating an inclusive, welcoming space for everyone, and that was something that couldn't be taken for granted. The incident with Sarah had been a turning point, but it had also been a reminder that growth and change don't happen overnight. It takes time, effort, and the willingness to learn from your mistakes. But the most important thing was that everyone, from the staff to the customers, was committed to doing better and being better. And as James looked around the diner one last time, he felt a sense of pride. The diner was more than just a business, it was a reflection of the values that he believed in. It was a place where people could come together, where differences were set aside, and where respect and kindness were always on the menu. And that, he knew, was something worth fighting for.